Okay, so we are going to continue here with Theaetetus, the Platonic dialogue. This is part 5. The overall content of this dialogue is about epistemology. This is about knowledge. It's about the origin of knowledge. It is about what is knowledge, the study of knowledge. And we left off at sort of a jumping off point. It was an interesting segue that Socrates had taken. But I'd like to read the paragraph that is most pertinent to the place where we're going to pick up here. These are the two types, Theodorus. He's speaking in two types of men. There is the one who has been brought up in true freedom and leisure, the man you call a philosopher, a man to whom it is no disgrace to appear simple and good for nothing when he is confronted with menial tasks, when, for instance, he doesn't know how to make a bed, or how to sweeten a sauce, or a flattering speech. Then you have the other, the man who is keen and smart at doing all these jobs, but does not know how to strike up a song in his turn like a free man, or how to tune strings of common speech to the fitting praise of the life of gods and of the happy among men. And so this is where we left off with, and then we took a little detour. And this diversion, I think, was due to Theodorus's comments. He says, Socrates, if your words convinced everyone as they do me, there would be more peace and less evil on earth. And I think that Theodorus said this because of perhaps the justice that Socrates had shown to the different types of people that he saw. Now he equally critiqued the philosophers, of whom he is a part of, and also the practical man, the man that has the skills, that is well accomplished in society. One of the analogies that he uses is the man of the courts. But this diversion in the conversation then goes to why a man should be virtuous, in the direction that he should point himself to. And he points to the reason that one should avoid injustice, the one that should avoid vice, is not for the selfish reasons. It is not for one's reputation. It is for something farther. It is for something deeper. That there is an actual, I don't want to necessarily say benefit, because we have to remove the selfish component from it. It is almost as if we are aligning ourselves to the nature of the way of things. And we will benefit from it if we do it. He said that we should be as much like a god as possible, so that we can limit our vices and be as good as possible. And in matters of judgment, both in the life of man and after his life is finished, I think it's often difficult to see exactly what it means, why there is punishment, why there is judgment at all. And certainly there are no shortage of people out there that live their lives in such a way as to participate in a sort of kayfabe, this professional wrestling that everybody knows is a fake experience. There's multiple directions I can go with that analogy. some of them not entirely negative, but I mean that this falsery and this fakery, it is not real. It represents something, a narrative arc, that can have some place in reality, but I think that their disingenuousness is the very thing that creates an air of instability. And to live in the fakery is to live in a world of adolescent satisfaction. Because the things that ultimately satisfy the ones who live for the more base things, like a good reputation or anything that benefits him on the surface. Wealth would be another example. And all of his actions and his behaviors are to benefit this play that he is performing in. And his actions and his behaviors are directed towards this play. Socrates says, the very ignorance of their true state fixes them the more firmly therein, for they do not know what is the penalty of injustice, which is the last thing of which a man should be ignorant. It is not what they suppose, scourging and death, things which they may entirely evade in spite of their wrongdoing. It is a penalty from which there is no escape. This is the key point. As we often wonder again about the nature of justice and how judgment comes down to us. We can point to examples where people are seemingly unjudged for their wickedness. And there's difficulty there, I think, squaring the circle. So what does it mean? If somebody can live a full life, they can have their riches and yet be a wicked person. What does this mean? Well, it means there may be a misplace in value there. That the true satisfaction and the true riches for the just individual is not dependent on some selfish desire. Socrates says, there are two patterns set up in reality. One is divine and supremely happy. The other has nothing of God in it, and is the pattern of the deepest unhappiness. This truth the evildoer does not see. Blinded by folly and utter lack of understanding, he fails to perceive that the effect of his unjust practices is to make him grow more and more like the one, and less like the other. For this he pays the penalty of living the life that corresponds to the pattern he is coming to resemble. And if we tell him that, unless he is delivered from this ability of his, again, the ability is it's in quotes here, but it is the false assumption that he has some, it's the false attribution of value to, it could be one's self-worth or the skills that one has obtained. We started this podcast with the quote about the practical man versus the philosopher. Socrates compares the practical man to that of the slave, and the philosopher to that of the free man. Of course, there are critiques of both. But this ability, if we look at the practical man, is wound up in a life of falsehood. It is learning to participate in the play and not freeing the mind and being able to understand the bigger picture. Unless he is delivered from this ability of his, when he dies, the place that is pure of all evil will not receive him, that he will forever go on living in this world a life after his own likeness. A bad man tied to bad company. He will but think, this is the way fools talk to a clever rascal like me. I think it's worth mentioning that the patterns that Socrates had mentioned, perhaps it's not all one or the other. We can encompass different patterns in our life. There are many aspects to an individual. There may be something in our lives that we just cannot, that is sinful, that we just cannot purge from ourselves, that holds us back. And yet there's another aspect of us that is truly loving, and is caring and is kind to a family member. But here we talk of the man that is ignorant, perhaps arrogant, and that does not wish to see, does not choose to see, and wishes to engage in this falsehood, this acting. And I think the point here is that the degree to which the person does this is the degree to which the sin encompasses that individual. And as that happens, they are removed further and further from reality. And it's not so much that they are aware of this pollution of the soul. It is as if they find comfort in their own demise. They find comfort in the finitude. Their sight is fixed upon the ground. It is not at the horizon. And as such, the true success in life is unable to be fully grasped or seen. I think of the case of the father that does well to provide for his family, but knows nothing of love, has no intimate connection with his wife or his children. Again, Socrates says, this truth the evildoer does not see. Blinded by folly and utter lack of understanding, he fails to perceive that the effect of his unjust practices is to make him grow more and more like the one and less and like the other. For this he pays the penalty of living the life that corresponds to the pattern he is coming to resemble. Now again, paying the price may not even be known to the individual. This is I think the hard part about justice. Because reality, although we are active participants in our reality, we have to understand that we are not the totality of reality. And since we are not the totality of reality, if we are sinful and if we choose to move towards the pattern of unhappiness or evil, whatever you want to call it, the perception of this may be very poor. Again, it's this sort of wallowing in ignorance. I think many of us would like to say that if we found ourselves going down the wrong path, we would know it, we would feel it. In some cases, perhaps that is true, but again, we are not the sum total of all of reality. There are things for which it is difficult to know. And as such, the things for which we do not know may be the very thing that blinds our eyes to what is more and what is greater, what is better, what is true and good. And when Socrates says, he will but think, this is the way fools talk to a clever rascal like me. Again, it's this self-absorbed nature of the wicked person that says, well, look what I've accomplished. Of course he's going to speak to me in this way. He hasn't accomplished the same sort of thing. It's the failure to see. And of course there are legitimate examples of people who are jealous, who may make a critique like that. And the critique is unfounded. But there is truth. And in the case that we are discussing here, Socrates is coming from a place of understanding. And from that place, he is able to more accurately see perhaps wickedness, ignorance, and folly. Socrates says, I know it, my friend, but there is one accident to which the unjust man is liable. When it comes to giving and taking an account in private discussion of the things he disparages, he is willing to stand his ground like a man for long enough, instead of running away like a coward. Then, my friend, an odd thing happens. In the end, the things he says do not satisfy even himself. That famous eloquence of his somehow dries up, and he is left looking nothing more than a child. It's that realization of the poverty of misplaced virtue. A life lived of chasing riches. Of lowly meaning. And so this is where the diversion ends, and we begin back up with the two characters that we were discussing before, the philosopher and the practical man. Socrates says, but we had better leave it there. All this is really a digression, and if we go on, a flood of new subjects will pour in and overwhelm our original argument. So if you don't mind, we will go back to what we were saying before. Theodorus says, as a matter of fact, Socrates, I like listening to this kind of talk. It is easier for a man of my years to follow. Still, if you like, let us go back to the argument. Socrates says, well, then, we were at somewhere about this point in the argument, weren't we? We were speaking of the people who assert a being that is in motion, and whom hold that for every individual things always are whatever they seem to him to be. And we said that they were prepared to stand upon their principle in almost every case, not least in questions of what is just and right. Here, they are perfectly ready to maintain that whatever any community decides to be just and right, and establishes as such, actually is what is just and right for that community, and for as long as it remains so established. On the other hand, when it is a question of what things are good, we no longer find anyone so heroic that he will venture to contend that whatever a community thinks useful and establishes really is useful, so long as it is the established order. Unless, of course, he means that it is called useful, but that would be making a game of our argument, wouldn't it? So here we see another thread of the conversation before the diversion. We were talking about this is quite again, it's a lengthy conversation, and it would be appropriate, I think, to return to some of the previous episodes of this dialogue to understand it, but in short, it has to do with perception. It has to do with one's understanding, one's personal experience. Again, Socrates says, he sums it up well, and he says, well, then we were at somewhere about this point in the argument, weren't we? We were speaking of the people who assert a being that is in motion. So stopping there, a being that is in motion. So we were talking about Protagoras in previous episodes. And there's this contention, along with Theaetetus, that everything is in motion. There is a active infinite multitude, and there's a passive infinite multitude. The active is the generative principle, and the passive is the sort of the finite, or all that is. It is the thing, the infinite that is beyond measure, but it is the thing that is, the things that are. And we had the Protagoras contention, which says that there are people who hold that for every individual things are whatever they seem to him to be. And this is the matter of perception. And this stimulates conversations about the nature of perception and the seemingly inherent relativism therein. And how is it that we can actually come to know something that is... it's hard to say, but maybe independent of our senses. Or we could say that, how is it that we can understand things across individual experience? That might be a better way to put it, because as we understand, as we know, senses and how they are perceived can be variable. And in certain cases and in certain instances, like the analogy that Socrates had brought up previously about the man who is sick and the man who is healthy, there is a difference in perception there in terms of the taste of what is sweet and what is bitter. Now, the experience to one is different than the experience to other, even though they are taking in information from the environment in the same way. They're consuming the same substance. And the question is, well, what do we do with this potential difference in the perception of our experiences? And Socrates continues, and he says that they were prepared, these being the ones that hold the philosophy of Protagoras, that everything seems to him, the way that things seem to him are the way that things are. So these people are prepared to stand upon their principle in almost every case, not least in questions of what is right, or what is just and right. Here they are perfectly ready to maintain that whatever any community decides to be just and right and establishes as such actually is what is just and right for that community, and for as long as it remains so established. And this also gets into a previous conversation, a previous dialogue, Theaetetus, about the etymology of words. And how much of our language is wound up in convention. And that there are this convention, which is, again, this thing that is made separate. It's distinct from the fundamental aspects of language, which Socrates might explain as the way in which we manipulate sounds to represent or to mimic the environment. He says, well, if we truly have a language that is representative of the external world, the sounds that we produce with our mouths should represent the fundamental things about nature that we experience, that we perceive. And perhaps some words are this way. There are letters maybe that sound like a particular shape or whatever. But at a certain point, the meaning that is attributed to the word, especially as you scale up into more complicated things, concepts and topics, the binding force becomes more and more a matter of convention. It becomes a relational thing. It evolves with people as they communicate with one another. And the thing about this convention is that it is perhaps rather dissatisfying I guess in certain cases, that it is not something that is tied as strongly to base reality as something like vision. We could be born of a different race, different cultures, different language, or different culture than there being that we are raised under a different rules of language. And despite those differences, if we have something like vision, of course there are variability in that population as well, but for the most part, in the general population, the vision is fairly consistent among individuals. But the language is not, and therefore the meaning is not. And when I say the meaning is not, now the fundamental pattern of the meaning that is represented by the language, I think, is the same. But the infrastructure that is used to understand and to interpret reality, to establish that convention, is different. And so it makes it very difficult for people to express to people that have a different language what one means. Now, we can get meaning across through many different aspects of behavior and action and all this sort of thing, but in terms of quick information processing, if you have a well-articulate individual communicating to another individual who is receptive to the level of articulation, the degree to which one can spread information and meaning to another individual is vastly superior than to just a perpetual game of charades, especially when we are dealing with matters of abstraction. And so to return to Socrates here, just as we have the man who believes that what he experiences is true for him, despite the inherent subjectivism, or we could say the potential danger for faulty information. It is the belief of the personal language, and the other individuals all have their own different personal languages. You could see how this would be problematic in the long run. So we have this issue, and then we progress further in that conversation, in that dialogue, to suggest that it scales not just at the level of the individual, but it scales up to the level of the culture, of the society, of the community, and that whatever that community establishes as just or right for itself is, in fact, just or right, and that there's nothing outside of it or above it that actually is the thing that dictates what is right or what is wrong. It is the experience of that culture and society that decides its rightness or wrongness. Again, it's the convention. But just saying that the convention is the thing, I think, therein lies part of the problem, because if the convention was the thing that is, then what it represents is nil. It's the convention itself is above the actual meaning, and the meaning is the substance that the convention is there to represent in the first place. Right? So the meaning is actually the thing that is the superior object or superior thing here, for which we have the convention. And the meaning then is dependent upon something that is what we might say objective, because there are truly things that we can establish as convention, the different meaning, different things that we consider to be right or wrong, that actually we may consider something to be right when it is actually wrong, and given that discrepancy, we will experience a judgment at some point. There will be some breakdown in some part or some aspect of the culture of the society or some institution, and changes will have to be made. The new conventions will have to be established to reorient people to something that is more just or true, a new understanding of the meaning of behind the word. And again, just to reiterate, if it is just the case that what it is for a culture to believe is right for that culture, it would seemingly reject any possibility of judgment. It is what we were discussing before about the ignorant person, the person who continually lives a certain way after a certain pattern of reality that moves them farther and farther away of what is. And as they move farther away from what is, they become more and more diluted. Their soul becomes, the volume of the soul becomes less and less. Their sight becomes dimmer and dimmer. And to the individual, their experience might be great. They might be having a grand old time. But in terms of the possibility of the human and the range of human experience, it's going to be very limited. So again, we left off with the community decides whatever any community decides to be just and right and establishes as such actually is just and right for that community, and for as long as it remains so established. On the other hand, when it is a question of what things are good, now this is sort of what we're talking about. When it comes to things that are good, when it comes to things that have some sort of standard that are outside of the individual experience, they have an objective standard. It's hard to break out of the Cartesian language here, but has some objective standard. And when I say it's hard to break out of the Cartesian framework, I mean to say that if I say objective, it is not just purely objective, right? Because there is some standard that is outside of the individual, but the individual also participates with the object, whether they know it or not. Because, if they're in line with it, with the good, then they will receive good things. If they are not in line with it, they're going to be judged, right, in that language and not receive good things or have things taken from them. And in that way, it is a standard that is outside of the individual, but it cannot, it wouldn't be right to say that it doesn't exist without the individual, but the individual experience is fundamental to knowing in that sense. Okay, so that aside, on the other hand, again, when it is a question of what things are good, we no longer find anyone so heroic that he will venture to contend that whatever a community thinks useful and establishes really is useful, so long as it is the established order. And so what does that mean? So when it comes to the matters of good, now this is a lofty thing, and people all of a sudden that hold this view of this supreme subjectivism, or the supremacy of the subjective experience, without the outside component, without the outside relational component, then they won't take it upon themselves to admit that whatever the community thinks useful in terms of the good and establishes really is useful, because deep down they believe that the good actually is something in and of itself, and we always are in some way related to it. We can't escape it. Unless, Socrates continues, of course he means that it is called useful. But that would be making a game of our argument, wouldn't it? Now, I'm not exactly sure what Socrates means by this last statement, unless, of course, he means that it is called. Now, called is in italics, and then useful is in quotes. Now, if something is to be called, it means means it is to be represented by language, it seems to suggest that there is an arbitrary distinction for what is considered to be useful. And if we play the arbitrary game, or again, that subjective game, then it truly is a game that we are playing. Because then it gets lost in the subjective definitions, or the definitions of the individual, and it ignores the relationship to that which is outside of the individual. Theodorus says, or he replies, "It would indeed." Socrates continues, "Let us suppose, then, that he is not talking about the name useful, but has in view the thing to which it is applied." Agreed. It is surely this that a government aims at when it legislates whatever name it calls it. A community always makes such laws as are most useful to it, so far as the limits of its judgment and capacity permit. Or do you think that legislation may have some other object in view? So if I understand what he's saying here, when Socrates says, "Let us suppose then that he is not talking about the name useful, but has in view the thing to which it is applied," he's talking about this relational aspect. For if we are just talking about the name useful, we are, again, engaging in a conversation of meaning. We are engaging in the relative conversation, the relative meaning of things as it pertains to the individual, but has in view the thing to which it is applied. So, not just the name useful, but now we're considering that relationship to the object. Now Socrates says that now truly the aim of the government, when it legislates, is to legislate after what is useful. Forget about the name, whatever it calls it. Now Theodorus agrees with this. He says, "Oh no, not at all," in response to, does legislation have any other object in view? Socrates says, "And does a community always achieve this object, or are there always a number of failures?" Theodorus says, "It seems to me that there are failures." Socrates says, "Now we might put this matter in a rather different way, and be still more likely to get people generally to agree with our conclusions. I mean, one might put a question about the whole class of things to which what is useful belongs. These things are concerned, I take it, with future time. Thus, when we legislate, we make the laws that are going to be useful in the time to come. This kind of thing we may properly call future." Theodorus says, "Yes, certainly. Come then, let's put a question to Protagoras, or anyone who professes the same views. Now, Protagoras, man is the measure of all things, as he says, as you people say, of white and heavy and light and all that kind of thing without exception. He has the criterion of these things within himself, so when he thinks that they are as he experiences them, he thinks what is true, and what really is for him. Isn't that so?" Theodorus says it is. "Then, Protagoras, we shall say, what about things that are going to be in the future? Has a man the criterion of these within himself? When he thinks certain things will be, do they actually happen for him as he thought they would? Take heat, for example. Suppose the ordinary man thinks he is going to take a fever, and that is his temperature will go up to fever point, while another man, this time a doctor, thinks the opposite. Do we hold that the future will confirm either the one judgment or the other, or are we to say that it will confirm both? That is, that for the doctor, the man will not have a temperature or be suffering from fever, while himself he will?" Theodorus says that would be absurd. So Socrates says that there are plenty of things that we consider we can consider to be useful. One might put a question, as he says, about the whole class of things to which what is useful belongs. But he says these things are concerned, I take it, with future time. Now he talks about legislation being sort of a glimpse into the future, that we consider something to be useful, and then in its usefulness we imagine what we can do at the present that will impact us in the future. So if we legislate, we put a certain law into place, we expect in the future that there will be some utility. And so we take into account a prominent figure, philosophical figure of the time, Protagoras, and we say of his view that man is the measure of all things. Again, this is the subject, this continual individual experience that the thing that man perceives is the thing that is. He says, as you people say, and he gives a bunch of different examples of white and heavy and light and all things of that kind of thing without exception. And these are the things that again have to involve the relationship to the external world, to the way one perceives certain things. And we've talked about whiteness, heaviness, lightness at length. So I'd recommend previous episodes for that. But the key point is that under this view, the criterion of things are within himself. So when he thinks that they are as he experiences them, he thinks what is true and what really is for him. That's the key point there. Now Socrates raises the point about what about things that are going to be in the future? Now I think that the analogy that he ultimately gives about the doctor can be given at the present as well, about the nature of the nature of the individual and what he perceives, given an expert in a field about a certain object and the perception of that object and its relationship to the individual. But here we are considering the future. He asks, has a man the criterion of these within himself, the things of the future? He says, take heat, for example. There's a man that thinks he's going to take fever, that his temperature will go up to that feverish point. Now another man, a man of particular distinction, that is a doctor who professes himself to know or to be an expert in the subject of fever and in the rising of temperature as a result. He thinks the opposite. Now, presumably he would think opposite because of some characteristics, some quality, some observation about the subject or the individual at hand that would make him believe, or that would lead him to think otherwise. Do we hold that the future will confirm either the one judgment or the other? Or are we to say that it will confirm both? That is, that for the doctor, the man will not have a temperature or be suffering from fever, while for himself he will. Now it's absurd because both conditions cannot be true. You cannot satisfy the doctor's belief that the fever will not occur while also satisfying the opinion of the man that the fever will occur, because eventually something will happen, and given that something will happen, and we will know the results of what happened, that will either prove or disprove the opinions of the individuals involved here. Socrates says, but when there is a question of the sweetness and dryness of the next vintage. I presume it would always be the grower's judgment that would carry authority, rather than that of a musician. Now, one has the authority because one has the experience, one has gone through the process of the observation, one has tasted a lot of things about sweetness and dryness. Theodorus says, of course. Nor again in any question of what will be in tune or out of tune would be the judgment of a teacher of gymnastic be superior to that of a musician. Even about what is going to seem to be in tune to the gymnastic master himself. Theodorus says, no, never. Or suppose a dinner is being prepared. Even the guest who is going to eat, if he has no knowledge of cooking, will not be able to pronounce so authoritative a verdict as the professional cook on how nice it is going to be. I say going to be because we had better not at this stage press our point as regards what is now pleasant to any individual, or what has been in the past. Our question for the moment is whether the individual himself is the best judge for himself, or what is going to seem to be for him in the future. Or, we will ask, would not you, Protagoras, predict better than any layman about the persuasive effect that speeches in a law court will have upon any one of us? Now, it's an interesting and difficult question, because we have to wonder if it depends on the circumstance or the context. We've been talking thus far about respective experts in the field and their opinion about certain matters over the opinion of the layman. Now, in terms of probability, certainly it would be a higher probability for the doctor or the musician or the cook to have a greater expertise about their discipline than the person who has not committed large amounts of time to those disciplines. It doesn't necessarily mean that the judgment of the layman is wrong compared to the expert. It is possible that this could be the case. Experts get things wrong all the time, but again, as a matter of probability, it is less likely that the expert would get the judgment wrong over the individual. But what about matters of concern here, which are the subjective experience? Now, in the modern day, the frame is, like I've said before, it's Cartesian. It is the subject-object paradigm. And that our approach to solving these matters of certainty is to take a certain methodological approach, which is the scientific method. It's a process of observation, of controlling the environment so that we don't have extraneous variables influence the results of our testing. And as we test something, we put it through a control, again, a controlled environment. We test it against a control, and we observe its results. And through those results, after being put in that environment, after the test is conducted in a certain environment and it yields certain results, we then speak with a certain degree of authority that it is very likely that the answer to our hypothesis is as follows according to these results, given this experiment. Now, of course, the experiment can be repeated. But then again, this may satisfy certain aspects of our reality. It'll satisfy concrete questions. But in terms of the matter of the individual and his desires and his perceptions, what can we say of that? Is it right for us to say that one's preference in terms of his culinary appetite is false, while the perceptions of the professional cook are true? And what of the musician? Is it false for an individual, a layman that hears a particular piece of music, to have a taste that is false, whereas the musician has the correct one? But here it seems to be a matter not only of perspective, but also of, there's a integration aspect. Now if we focus just on music for a moment, in the modern day we have no shortage of popular songs, popular music. There are many that will say a particular piece of music is better than another. There are many that will reject a certain genre for the way that it sounds. But just as in language, we have particular sounds that may represent sounds within the environment, and if we put these sounds together, they may have some meaning, but above that, our convention is such that we learn how to hear certain elements that are put together in a certain way to mean something. And sometimes, oftentimes, this meaning has nothing to do with the natural characteristics of the world that's in front of us. Sometimes they do. Sometimes the words that we produce kind of sound like what we might experience of the objects in the environment. Similarly, I think musical taste, it can catch us, just like a sound can catch the ear of an individual. I can make all sorts of sounds that will grab one's attention. I can make sounds with my mouth. I can make sounds with a musical instrument. Some sounds will sound better than others. Some sounds will grab someone's attention because it's a sound, and they just want to orient their attention to see where the sound is coming from, what is making that sound, why that sound is being made. But in terms of pleasure, there are patterns of sounds that are pleasurable, I think, to the human ear. And we could break down what the fundamentals of those are. It could be the regularity or repeatability of a certain pattern. It could be an intricate pattern. It could be the combination of a particular sound, like the gliding of a bow across a string that produces something that is attractive to the human mind. And not just the sound, but again the pattern, the notes that are played, and the sequence in which they are played, that increases its attractiveness to the individual ear. And there are differences between individuals. Some individuals may not hear what another individual hears. It may not grab an individual like it does another. And there is a question, well, why is that the case? Is it, in the Pythagorean view, that it is truly that what a man perceives to be true is so true to him, that the pattern of music that he perceives is truly something that is worth orienting one's attention towards? And I would say that, just to give my 2 cents, it's difficult to say, but perhaps it's not. Because if we are going to orient ourselves towards the ultimate and what is good, our convention, our convention can be based on any number of things. Again, our language will have a certain structure to it, but the structure really doesn't determine its usefulness. We ultimately decide how it is used and how to integrate it and how to communicate with one another. How we choose to do so, I think, is an important one, because the how is is caught up with the direction. It's caught up in, how we use it is, in some sense, in relation to the future, in relationship to the orientation of the human being. And when I say orientation of the human being, it's the direction that we look. Now that's a figurative expression because I don't mean literally. But we can use our language for direction. We can use our language for, expression, for moving people closer together. We can use it in a divisive manner. We could use it to break. We could use it to build. There are any number of things that we can do with the tool that is language. Just as with music, there are many things that we can do with the tool that is music. There are many things that we can do with the tool that is the culinary arts. We can produce something that is largely, in terms of an experiential, from the experiential aspect, is largely pleasurable to individuals. But how we integrate that into our experience, I think, is important. Because we could just as easily design something that, design a food, let's say like a McDonald's, that is pleasurable to a lot of people, that it appeals to the perceptions of a lot of people. And it does so in such a way that is almost, it's destructive. It's evil, in a sense, because it preys upon the desire. It preys upon the base desire. It is not something that is a sophisticated thing, the culinary expert that puts something together that is tasty, certainly, but there's also other elements, the way that it is presented, the environment that it is presented in, the requirements of the individuals and their presentation within that environment. It's all sort of wound up in it. And the same, I think, applies to music. And so the question really is a question of level. It is, where are we in terms of this meaning hierarchy? If we are at the base level and just talking about perception and talking about things that are enjoyable to individuals, this can be quite variable, I think. But it is variable in the way that it appeals to the base desire, in terms of the base excitement of the neural pathways and their various communication and integration with one another. Now, I think the variability between individuals here doesn't mean that the truth of enjoyment is, I have to be careful here, but I don't think it means that it is restricted to the base level. For if we are to integrate something into something that is more meaningful, into a process, if we are to cultivate something, and we were to move it to another level, I think then what is at the fundamental level, like with language, the expression of speech, the very fact that I can pass wind through my vocal cords to produce a sound, and then manipulate it with my mouth and my tongue and all this to produce a language that is perceivable by somebody else. It's not really a matter of, is my voice appealing to the individual? I mean, that can vary. I can make it more or less appealing, perhaps. But the meaning that is laced on top of it, the things that I say, will, I think, make the voice more or less attractive. Just as we know a voice of the person that we love, let's say. There are other things for which we can grab onto that will say that a particular voice or a particular sound is good because there is a certain meaningfulness attached to it. So relativism, I think, is still here, and it still plagues our conversation. That's why Socrates and Theodorus are still engaged in this conversation. It didn't just end a number of pages ago. And so I understand that I haven't landed my opinion here. But all of those things, I think, need to be out in the environment. They need to be out in the conscious sphere as we continue so that we can bring these things to a point. So what can we say from the conversation so far? Of the condition of future matters, in which you have one opinion versus another, eventually the future will determine exactly who is right and who is wrong. And then that philosophy of relativism in that sense will not hold, because one person will be correct. In terms of the fever, either the fever will occur or it will not. Both cases will not be right at the same time. Then there's the question of the sweetness and dryness. Socrates brings up the discussion of the grower, who carries some authority rather than that of the musician. But where does this authority rest? Does it rest within the truthfulness of the perception of sweetness and dryness? Or does it rest in the overall probability that they understand what is likely to make something sweeter or drier, perhaps? Where the musician knows nothing of this. Certainly the musician has the ability to perceive of what another is an expert of, just as the grower will be able to perceive the product of the musician and make his own judgments. But the musician is still the musician, and they know certain things about the musical form and the production therein within the patterns of sound and how to put them together. Now this knowing in this sense has to do with a particular realm of abstraction. In the case of the musician, the patterns of sound. In the case of the grower, sweetness, dryness of the next vintage. Here we could say this is sort of the winemaker. He's growing the grapes to make the wine. This would be the vintage. Now they know what will produce this sensation or this perception. They don't know how another individual will perceive it. And so the question is, well, where is the truth here? Because at a certain point we are relying on the perception of the musician and the product of the musician and the perception of the grower for his understanding of the sweetness and dryness. But again, there is a degree of knowing that is separate, it would seem, from perception. Again, the music would be the integration of the patterns in a particular way to produce something that is more than just incoherent rambling, incoherent sounds. Of the grower, there is the knowledge and understanding of actually how to put various aspects together to produce a vintage, full stop. When it comes to a matter of perception, it's not perfect. This is a point that we have come to before, that the experience of the human being, all of the sensory organs, is not perfect to perceive the external world. There are many things for which we have no sense organs to perceive that exist in the physical world. Now, we all share common characteristics about our perception. We all have very similar organs to produce. There's variability, again, among our population. Among the race of human beings, there's variability. Some pathological, some not. Well, let's take an example. Let's take an interesting example about music. What if it is the case that there is a musician that is deaf? They cannot hear anything. Do we trust that musician? Well, it depends on what he produces, right? We know of a famous composer that was deaf, that produced amazing compositions. And because of his abstraction and his understanding, his knowledge of the musical form, he was able to produce something that was appealing to many individuals, regardless of his lack of perception. And so in that respect, that type of knowing transcends perception. Now, it doesn't mean that the individuals in question found it attractive. But at a certain point, I think we all have to acknowledge that the ability to perceive can be supplanted by aspects of the mind. They can be overcome by other sensory organs that can establish an understanding of the environment that surrounds the lack of sensory perception, to give us an understanding of what that perception might be, just as we can understand what exists beyond the visual spectrum. And when I say that, I mean the electromagnetic spectrum. Our visible light is a very small portion of everything that is in that spectrum. If anything from gamma rays to radio waves and beyond, our visible light is a certain frequency within that energy, or the wavelengths there. And so our perception can be deceptive, because knowing can transcend what we are able to perceive. But our experience is important when we consume and we do perceive information from the environment. Because eventually there has to be some way that we get information. We cannot just exist in a vacuum. Our brains would not be able to develop in a vacuum, that there was nothing. So we have, I think, a few different processes here. We have this sort of compensative process. We have a degree of relative perception that's not perfect. It doesn't perfectly map to true reality. We have individual tastes, desires, which can be modified based on our orientation. Orientation to what? We would say perhaps the orientation to the good or to God. And if we do that, our tastes will change. Our relationship to our own subjective understanding of our perceptions can change. Again, this is due to the abstraction and our understanding of the order of things as they are in reality. If we choose to believe how reality is, and we have a proper understanding of reality, we will orient our response to our own perceptions accordingly. But it's a difficult thing, being properly oriented. There are plenty of questions that come up initially. But I'd like to read this section again. I think it's fundamental. My friend, there are two patterns set up in reality. One is divine and supremely happy, The other has nothing of God in it, and is the pattern of the deepest unhappiness. This truth the evildoer does not see, blinded by folly and utter lack of understanding. He fails to perceive that the effects of his unjust practices is to make him grow more and more like the one, and less like the other. For this he pays the penalty of living the life that corresponds to the pattern he is coming to resemble. And if we tell him that, unless he is delivered from this ability of his, abilities in quotes, when he dies, the place that is pure of all evil will not receive him, that he will forever go on living in this world a life after his own likeness, a bad man tied to bad company, but he will think, this is the way fools talk to a clever rascal like me. And so here we see denial. Here we see one person that sees farther than the other. And it's an interesting thing for Socrates in this example, or the imagined person that is dealing with this other imagined person, the one that is ignorant, blind, the truth that the evildoer does not see, blinded by folly and utter lack of understanding. In the case of the one that can see, they can see how this behavior leads to some consequence. So they can see a pattern. The larger question, well, what is the larger fundamental pattern? Of course, we have the pattern of happiness, and the other has nothing of God in it, but that's only one level of explanation. We need a threaded reality so that all levels are connected. And when I say all levels, I mean just as we climb the stairs to get to a new floor, we are an active participant in climbing up every bit of that latitude. We just don't happen to be at the top level, because we wouldn't understand. I mean, first of all, we wouldn't just get there. We wouldn't just teleport there. If it was indeed the case that there were two levels and one only accessible by a staircase, but there was no staircase, then it's impossible to get to that level. We could think about that level, but without doing the work, and without understanding the intermediate steps, then it's incomplete. It's incomplete practically. And I don't mean to make unnecessary judgment here of Socrates. That's not the point. But just a general thought about how to get to the understanding of seeing is more of my point, and how to avoid being the person that runs into his folly without even knowing it. It's the committing a crime but not knowing the law. It's the falling into sin without knowing the behavior that is sinful. It's a difficult thing. But if the enlightened mind and the pious mind is one that's able to determine these patterns, then that's certainly one that would have an advantage over another. But we don't even have to see it in that lens. We could just see it as the advantage truly can be growth of the individual and proliferation of the experience of life. Socrates continues, he says, I know it, my friend, but there is one accident to which the unjust man is liable. When it comes to giving and taking an account in private discussions of the things he disparages, when he is willing to stand his ground like a man for long enough, instead of running away like a coward, then, my friend, an odd thing happens. In the end, the things he says do not satisfy even himself. That famous eloquence of his somehow dries up, and he is left looking nothing more than a child. I know I've read this paragraph before, but an interesting thing about it is you see a person that sort of, when they are left to speak of their own accord, perhaps when they don't constantly keep themselves busy, that the mind is allowed actually to be, again, unencumbered by the easy things of surrender, I guess I could say, throughout the daily life and existence. That is, to put one's head down and focus on one's work. Focus on the phone. Focus on preparing a meal. But don't focus on, are you happy? Don't focus on yourself too much. And certainly there are things to be said about that. But these are just some examples. It doesn't necessarily mean much about the situation that Socrates is laying out here. But the picture, I think, is an important one, because this person, they are coming to a realization. They're understanding the ignorance. They are seeing what Socrates says that he can see, or the judgment that he proposes, the implication there. He begins to see that sight. And as he does so, Socrates says, an odd thing happens. In the end, the things he says do not satisfy even himself. That famous eloquence of his somehow dries up, and he is left looking nothing more than a child. And to realize one's own ignorance is in some sense to realize the adolescence that continues in all of us. It's the thing that we learn from, to grow from, and to mature, to become an adult that knows more truth than a younger person. And to a proud person, I think that this could be devastating. This could be a devastating realization. Okay, so let's return to our main point. We are considering Protagoras. We are considering our central question, that the man is the measure of all things. But in particular, at this point, we are taking into account the future. Decisions of future matters. And so far, Socrates is making the point that in cases of future decisions, the expert in a particular situation is the one that is more likely, or most likely, to have a more accurate prediction of the best outcome for the individual, regardless of the individual's perception about what will come to pass. Now, it doesn't mean that the professional or the expert is always going to be right and the individual is always going to be wrong, but for the most part, in terms of the examples that we were given of the doctor and of the patient, the doctor is probably more likely to predict when the temperature will, or when the patient will have a fever. Likewise, the musician will know when an instrument is in tune, probably better than a gymnastic teacher. Socrates continues and he says, or suppose a dinner is being prepared. Even the guest who is going to eat it, if he has no knowledge of cooking, will not be able to pronounce so authoritative a verdict as a professional cook on how nice it is going to be. I say going to be, because we had better not at this stage press our point as regards to what is now pleasant to any individual, or what has been in the past. Our question for the moment is whether the individual himself is the best judge for himself of what is going to seem to be for himself in the future, for him in the future. Or, we will ask, would you not, Protagoras, predict better than any layman about the persuasive effect that speeches in a law court will have upon any one of us. Theodorus says, and in fact, Socrates, this at any rate is a point on which Protagoras used to make strong claims to superiority over other people. Socrates says, of course he did, my dear good fellow. No one would have paid large fees for the privilege of talking with him if he had not been in the habit of persuading his pupils that he was a better judge than any fortune-teller, or anyone else, about what is going to be and seem to be in the future. That's true enough. Legislation also, and what is useful, is concerned with the future, and it would be generally admitted to be inevitable that a city, when it legislates, often fails to achieve what is the most useful. Theodorus says, yes, surely. Then we shall be giving your master fair measure if we tell him that he has now got to admit that one man is wiser than another, and that it is such a man who is the measure, but that I, the man who no special knowledge, have not by any means got to be a measure, a part which a recent speech in his defense was trying to force upon me, whether I liked it or not. Now that, Socrates, seems to me to be the chief point on which the theory is convicted of error. Though it stands convicted, also when it makes other men's judgments carry authority, and these turn out to involve thinking that Protagoras' statements are completely untrue. There is more than one point besides these, Theodorus, on which the conviction might be secured, at least so far as it is a matter of proving that not every man's judgment is true, but so long as we keep within the limits of that immediate present experience of the individual which gives rise to perception and to perceptual judgments, it is more difficult to convict these latter being untrue. But perhaps I'm talking nonsense. Perhaps it is not possible to convict them at all. Perhaps those who profess that they are perfectly evident and are always knowledgeable may be saying what really is. And it may be that our Theaetetus was not far from the mark with this proposition that knowledge and perception are the same thing. We shall have to come to closer grips with the theory, as the speech on behalf of Protagoras requires us to do. We shall have to consider and test this moving being with a capital B, and find whether it rings true or sounds as if it has some flaw in it. There's no small fight going on about it, anyway, and no shortage of fighting men. So we've come to the point where it's easy to see that in matters of the future, one man's judgment may be truer than another's. Now, we have talked a lot about perception and the judgment of perception in the present. What Socrates and Theodorus are still wrestling with is what to do about the immediate present experience of the individual, which gives rise to perceptions and to perceptual judgments. Socrates says it is more difficult to convict these latter of being untrue. Again, it's important to keep in mind that we are concerning ourselves with relativism here. We're trying to find the truth. We have in our argument come to that there are judgments that are wiser than others, that are perhaps more true than others when it comes to predicting future matters. Matters at present, what can we say of them? If I am to observe a quarter, certainly there are many things about the quarter that I observe to be consistent with another's observations. But there are also differences. Now, a straight object, I think, is a little bit easier to describe. When it comes to our distinctions, when it comes to our distinctions about the cold and the hot, for example, this is something that we talked about before. There is a certain relativism built into that language, where just the straight observation of the quarter, there may be multiple perspectives that I can take. But for the most part, given similar sense perception by another individual, which most human beings share, we will not come to any sort of disagreement about the quarter, unless perhaps the quarter is fixed, and that the head faces me and the tail's side faces the other. But we don't need to go into such situations. But in matters of hot and cold, we've talked about this at length, but the coldness and hotness is not an objective measure. It is an experience that is relative to the individual. And in that case, I think the individual does have some authority because it has to do with their own individual preference. Certain people have a higher threshold than others with regard to what is considered to be hot. They may stay out in the sun longer, doing what work they have or what business they have out in the sun, rather than another individual who may wish to sit in the shade and let the temperature cool before the work continues. And I think that so this matter, the matter at the present of perception and of experience, is what Socrates is still wrestling with. Theodorus says, "No, indeed, but in Ionia it seems to be even growing and assuming vast dimensions. On the side of this theory, the Heraclidian party is conducting a most vigorous campaign." Okay, so what is the Ionia? What is this word? Okay, so a quick internet search here reveals that Ionia was an ancient region located on the western coast of Anatolia, which is present-day Turkey, in the eastern part of the Aegean Sea. It was inhabited by a group of ancient Greek city-states known as the Ionians. Ionia was significant in Greek history and culture, particularly during the archaic and classical periods. It had a strong intellectual and cultural tradition and contribution to Greek society. It was the birthplace of many prominent Greek philosophers and scientists, poets, including Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes, Heraclitus, and Homer. It says also that during the time of Plato, Ionia was under Persian rule, but it still retained that strong cultural element. So when Theodorus says, but in Ionia it seems to be even growing and assuming vast dimensions on the side of this theory, the Heraclidian party is conducting a most vigorous campaign. That means that this campaign of the theory that we've been talking about is still culturally relevant at that location. And Socrates replies and he says, "The more reason then, my dear Theodorus, why we should examine it by going back to its first principle, which is the way they present it themselves." And here the principle is the principle that everything is really in motion. Theodorus says, "I quite agree. Socrates, these Heraclidian doctrines, or as you say, Homeric, or still more ancient, you can't discuss them in person with any of the people at Ephesus who profess to be adepts, any more than you could with a maniac. They are just like the things they say in their books, always on the move, As for abiding by what is said, or sticking to a question, or quietly answering and asking questions in turn, there is less than nothing of that in their capacity. That's an exaggeration, no doubt. There isn't so much as a tiny bit of repose in these people. If you ask any one of them a question, he will pull out some little enigmatic phrase from his quiver and shoot it off at you. And if you try to make him give an account of what he has said, you will only get hit by another, full of strange turns in language. You will never reach any conclusion with any of them, ever. Indeed, they never reach any conclusion with each other. They are so very careful not to allow anything to be stable, either in an argument or in their own souls. I suppose they think that if they did, there would be something that stands still, this being what they are totally at war with, and what they are determined to banish from the universe if they can. And so it's an interesting statement by Theodoras here, because I'm getting an image of a theory that is potentially unstable. Theodoras said that they actively move away from that which is stable because of the theory of everything is in motion. And I think that part of the thing that is troubling about it is, as Theodoras says, there is no real endpoint. There's no real answer. There's no, yes, that is so. There's just this constant circling. In the modern day, we are struggling with this Gnostic religious strain in United States culture. And it appears to us in the modern day as sort of in the contemporary sense, a Maoist revolutionary flair of the communist camp. And insofar as analogies go, in my mind, I think a lot about this experience, what is happening now in the culture. And I don't mean to say that this thing is the dominant culture. Certainly there is a heavy pushback against it, and it is one of the seemingly theoretical struggles of our time. But in terms of the analogy, this way of thinking, it's concerned about the rights of individuals. They want liberation at all levels. And yet, if you liberate all the way down, there is no stability. It's very similar to this Ionian school of thought. Much of our culture and our tradition, the Western liberal political tradition, has this element, a large component, I should say, of liberation philosophy. That we have to be liberated from false authority. And in many cases, there is good reason for our liberation. But liberation for liberation's sake, I think, it can be antagonistic to a free society. And it seems as though when you get far down enough, when the bonds just keep on being broken and reduced, then identity itself, whether it be from at the level of the nation or the level of the community, the level of the family, or the level of the individual, is dissolved, and the individual is left, rather than free, they are imprisoned in darkness. They are imprisoned in multiplicity. There is nothing that binds them to some center. Now, the revolution around that center, and the closeness to that center, and the operation within certain restraints, It gives the individual perspective, it gives them an identity, it gives them a degree of security. And this allows them to build upon that stable surface. It's the foundation of identity. But without it, and with it broken, it is, as I said, it's a prison of multiplicity. If you turn on a flashlight and absolute nothingness, you won't see anything. You'll see the light of the flashlight, but nothing will be illuminated because there's nothing there. There's nothing relative to it. There's nothing, perhaps that's not the way to put it, not necessarily relative to it, but there's nothing in its immediate environment that allows it to compare itself to and orient itself to something else. There's no relational component to it. And so it is a bit bizarre how similar this sort of thought is to what is happening today. Now, Socrates replies to Theodorus, and he says, "I dare say, Theodorus, you have seen these men only on the field of battle, and never been with them in times of peace. You don't belong to their set. I expect they keep such matters to be explained at leisure to their pupils, whom they want to make themselves, whom they want to make like themselves." And again, it's very similar, not only to the Chinese experience with the communists and the Red Guards being these constant, revolutionaries. They're constantly at battle or at war with something. In our modern day, this constant battle and war against restraints against the individual, and that, again, individual perspective needs to be liberated from the constraints of reality, essentially. And so there's always this enemy that one needs to be fighting against. If it's not somebody else, then eventually it's just going to be reality itself, because that is the thing that is actually binding, has the force to bind somebody. And the more that they are uncomfortable as they break the bonds, and they're more and more uncomfortable as they move away from the center of it, to which it gives a person identity and a sense of belonging, as they keep on inadvertently probably separating themselves from it, the battle continues to rage. There's always this new enemy, and the enemy may be the perception itself. It may be the uncomfortability itself. So on one hand, it is the rage against the light, the rage against the individual constraint. But then it is also when one liberates themselves as much as they can from the societal constraint, then the enemy is the perception. Because it's a confusing sort of thing. Because at some point, the perception does have to represent reality, even if there are some relative components in it, just like the hot and the cold. We are able to at least perceive of the hotness and the coldness. Now, we can't give it an objective measure, given our limitations to our sense perception. But it is a very real thing that we experience. And it would be a bizarre thing to have somebody in let's say a inhospitably cold environment try to liberate themselves from the idea of the cold. And they sort of go out into the environment with nothing on. And they say that the cold cannot oppress me any further. Well, I mean, that the reality of the cold will eventually lead to the death of the body. Now, before we move any further, Ephesus was an ancient Greek city located on the western coast of Anatolia, again, present-day Turkey, near the Aegean Sea. It was within the region of Ionia. It was one of the 12 cities of the Ionian League. And interestingly, Theodorus compares the people at Ephesus with maniacs. And you can't, it's sort of like having a conversation between a maniac. This is a person that's maybe overly expressive, irrational in their beliefs. There's a certain degree of madness within their character. And it's interesting to see exactly what the philosophy of, everything is in motion, what it means for these people, and how it manifests in their behavior. Theodorus, again, he says, as for abiding by what is said, or sticking to a question, or quietly answering and asking questions in turn, there is less than nothing of that in their capacity. He says as well, it's an exaggeration, but by and large, these people have difficulty staying still, which in turn makes it difficult to focus on anything for long enough to come to a conclusion. Again, the conclusion was another critique of his. You will never reach any conclusion with any of them, ever. Indeed, they never reach any conclusion with each other. They are so very careful not to allow anything to be stable, either in an argument or in their own souls. Now that's quite expressive, either in an argument or in their own souls. And this is, I think, what we were touching on before with the modern day movement, and sort of the communist Gnostic strain, the religious strain that has seemed to pervert our society. Socrates says, I dare say, Theodorus, you have seen these men only on the field of battle. Okay, this is something that we've discussed. These people that are constantly fighting. But he also says, and never, referring to Theodorus, you have never been with them in times of peace, as you don't belong to their set. I expect they keep such matters to be explained at leisure to their pupils, whom they want to make like themselves. Theodorus says, pupils, my good man. There are no pupils and teachers among these people. They just spring up on their own, one here, one there, whenever they happen to catch their inspiration, and no one of them will credit another with knowing anything. As I was just going to say, you will never get these men to give an account of themselves, willingly or unwillingly. What we must do is to take their doctrine out of their hands and consider it for ourselves, as we should a problem in geometry. I want to take a moment and continue the thread of thought about the Gnostic strain in the contemporary world and the Gnosticism of the old world. So just for quick reference here, Gnosticism, a quick internet search here, is a religious and philosophical movement that emerged in the early Christian era, primarily during the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. It encompasses a diverse set of beliefs and teachings that emphasize the acquisition of gnosis, which means knowledge or insight, as a means of attaining salvation or liberation from the material world. Again, this goes back to what we were saying, this salvation or liberation, this continual liberation. In this case, it's from the material world. It's, in some sense, a denial of reality, our physical structure, who we are as human beings. We are bound to material reality. There's no escaping it. Gnostics believe in a radical dualism between the spiritual realm, which is considered divine and perfect, and the material world, which is seen as flawed and corrupt. They hold that the material world was created by a lesser imperfect deity, known as the demiurge, while the supreme God, often referred to as monad or pleroma, exists in the spiritual realm. Gnosticism places a strong emphasis on esoteric knowledge and spiritual experience. Gnostics believe that salvation comes through acquiring this hidden knowledge, which reveals the true nature of the self, the divine realm, and the path to liberation from the material world. Gnostic texts, such as the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Philip, were discovered in the 20th century and provide insights into their teachings. And so this hidden knowledge, one can see knowledge that is not yet known, but that wouldn't be considered hidden knowledge. Knowledge that is not yet known would be knowledge that is out there to be had and to be learned. This Gnosticism seems to be similar to what Theodoras and Socrates are talking about here. This hidden knowledge, when would it come to an individual? Esoteric knowledge. Knowledge for the select few, for the chosen one perhaps. And for the select few, it seems as though they spring up out of nowhere. They claim to know it. Just as an individual may claim the truth of his own perception. There's no tether to this Gnosticism, it would seem. Anyway, I think this was good to bring up in this situation because of not only of the contemporary parallel, but also because of the similarity of this philosophy and Gnostic Christianity. I'm assuming that Gnosticism is older than Christianity. I see plenty of parallels with Gnosticism here. If this isn't considered to be Gnosticism, then it's quite close. It's quite approaching. If this is not the Greek Gnosticism, then I'm not sure exactly what would be. But in any case, Socrates says, "What you say is very reasonable. This problem now, we have inherited it. Have we not from the ancients? They used poetical forms which concealed from the majority of men their real meaning, namely, that ocean and Theaetetus, the origin of all things, are actually flowing streams, and nothing stands still. In more modern times, the problem is presented to us by men who, being more accomplished in these matters, plainly demonstrate their meaning so that even shoemakers may hear and assimilate their wisdom, and give up the silly idea that some things in this world stand still while others move. Learn that all things are in motion, and recognize the greatness of their instructors." But I was almost forgetting, Theodoras, that there are other thinkers who have announced the opposite view, who tell us that the unmoved is the universe. And other similar statements which we hear from a Melissus or a Parmenides, as against the whole party of the Heraclidians. These philosophers insist that all things are one, and that there is one, that's a capital O, one, stand still, itself within itself, having no place in which to move. What are we to do with all of these people, my friend? We have been gradually advancing till, without realizing it, we have got ourselves in between the two parties. And if we don't in some way manage to put up a fight and make our escape, we shall pay for it, like the people who play that game on the line in the wrestling schools. They get caught by both parties and pulled in opposite directions. Now I think we ought to begin by examining the other party, the fluent fellows we started to pursue. If they appear to us to be talking nonsense, we will help them to drag us over to the other side and try to escape the others. But if those who make their stand for the whole appear to be nearer the truth, we will take refuge with them from the men who move what should not be moved. And if it appears that neither party has a reasonable theory, then we shall be very absurd if we think that insignificant people like ourselves can have anything to say after we have rejected the views of men who lived so long ago and possessed all wisdom. Think now, Theodoras, is it of any use for us to go forward upon such a dangerous venture. Theodorus says, "We cannot refuse to examine the doctrine of these two schools." Socrates, "That couldn't be allowed." Socrates says, "Then we must examine them, if you feel so strongly about it. Now it seems to me that the proper starting point of our criticism is the nature of motion. What is this thing that they are talking about when they say that all things are in motion? I mean, for example, are they referring to one form of motion only, or, as I think, or two? But don't let this be only what I think. You commit yourself as well, so that we may come to grief together, if need be. Tell me, do you call it motion when a thing changes from one place to another, or turns around in the same place?" So, finally we are getting to the point that has been plaguing us all along. What is this motion? And it wasn't quite just in this dialogue, it's been in other dialogues too, where there's this constant nagging, what is this motion? When are we going to get to the conversation exactly on the point of motion? We've discussed the infinite, the active infinite multitude and the passive infinite multitude. But it always felt like they're, just like the Gnosticism that we were talking about, it felt like there was a gnosis there that we were trying to uncover, but it was hidden, and we just kept on spinning the wheels. Now, there were things around it that were certainly useful to know, but the exploration left us, I think, in a bit of a limbo, a bit of uncertainty, and unsatisfied ground that we were standing on. Unstable ground, perhaps is a better way to put it. So hopefully this conversation will turn into a more fruitful endeavor. But I think I'll end this episode here and continue next time with Theaetetus.